Thank you to the Bilchik Foundation for having us tonight. Like, I'm really, really excited to moderate this conversation with the amazing group of panelists here today. I'm going to introduce myself. So, Ricardo Aka, I'm the Senior Digital Organizer at Make the Road New York. We're the largest grassroots nonprofit organization in New York State. We provide services for immigrant communities, but we also do advocacy to advance policy for immigrant communities. And now my pronouns are he, him, and I'll pass it to Isabel.
Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Sandoval. I'm the director of Lingua Franca, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'll pass it on to Jet.
Hi, I'm Jet Tolentino. I'm one of the producers of Lingua Franca, pronouns he, him, and I'd like to pass it to Rose.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Rose Quizon Villazor. I am a professor at Rutgers Law School. I also run a center on immigration law and policy. I am so happy to be here tonight. And I will pass it on to Allegra.
My dog is howling like a coyote in the background all of a sudden. So anyway, I'm Allegra. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm an immigration attorney, and I work for an organization here in New Mexico and West Texas in the borderlands called Santa Fe Dreamers Project. And then one of the things we do is we spend a lot of time working in coalition on our border and in detention centers, making sure that transgender individuals are as safe as possible, trying to get through our political asylum system. Okay, Ricardo.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for those great introductions. So I just wanted to open up this question. One of the first scenes in the film, we see, Olivia's character, right, get a call from Olga, the elderly woman that she cares for, right, like in Brooklyn. Olga like doesn't know where she's at, right? Like she doesn't know that she's home, and so then Olivia, it's part of her job is to constantly remind her that she is home, right? So I really wanted to open up that question about what is home to you, right? Especially during this time, so I feel like that question is very broad for me. Like I grew up here in New York City. I grew up in Bushwick. Bushwick has been sort of part of like my home for the last 15 years, but I'm also proud to be a Mexican immigrant, right? And I think part of the reason why we fight, why I fight for immigrant communities is because I consider this country my home, right? So I just now wanted to ask all panelists, and I'll start maybe with Isabel, like, what is home to you in this context or like in this period right now?
For me, speaking from personal experience, and since I transitioned, home for me is a place where I feel safe and accepted for who and what I am. And I think when I started transitioning about 5 years ago, that's when I really started considering the US my home. As was depicted in the film, the Philippines passed a law a little over 10 years ago prohibiting transgender individuals from changing their name and gender marker in their official IDs and documents. And I am in a position where I have a Philippine passport that has my old name and gender marker, and I have a US green card that has my current legal name, which is Isabel, and a female gender marker. And it's the definition of home that I just gave also becomes murky and ambiguous and slippery because of the current political climate that we're in. Since Trump got elected in late 2016, and especially the first few months after the election, I was feeling very vulnerable and tense and anxious about my fate as not just a minority in the US, but as a storyteller and filmmaker that is making a film particularly about the plight of an undocumented transgender woman. So right now for me, the US feels like home, but I hope that it feels more like home once we get him out of the White House. Fingers crossed.
Absolutely, and I think we're like at a very like pivotal time about like being able to take action in the next upcoming election, right? And I think we all watched the debate, and last night was rough. but tonight we're like, we're all here and we're sharing our stories and we're talking about the importance of sharing like those immigrant experiences, the experiences of trans immigrant women, right? Because the immigration system is very, very complex, and I think that's why it's super important that you told this story from a different lens, right? From the lens of like a trans immigrant
Yeah.
Filipino woman, right? And I guess I want to pass it now to Jed. Like Jed, so what is home to you?
Hi. Structurally, my family is based in Iloilo City. That's where I was born, raised, and educated. Um, but I've been in the United States 18 years now. But I travel a lot in terms of work. And just like last year, I went to 20 countries. So I've adjusted to that kind of question about where is home to me. So to me, home is a feeling. I feeling like what Isabel said, where I belong, where I feel safe. I can easily adapt whichever environment I find myself, even if it's just for 2 days or 2 months or anything like that. So to me, it's more of, yeah, a feeling. That's where home is for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I want to pass it maybe to Rose. Tell us, Rose, I know you live in New Jersey. You do a lot of amazing work out there. So what is home to you?
So I work in New Jersey, but I too live in New York City. But with respect to the question, what is home to me? Like Isabel and Jet, I was born in the Philippines, but I left when I was 10, and I grew up in a small U.S. territory in the island of Saipan, Mariana Islands near Guam. And I then migrated because it's a U.S. territory. Then I wouldn't say I immigrated to the States, right? I just moved from Saipan to Texas when I went to college. So I was educated primarily in the American system, but through the lens of a colonized Pacific island. So home to me means the ability to feel that I belong in all the places that my family and I chose to be, and to be with our chosen family, whether blood or not. So in every place that I've lived, the Philippines, the Mariana Islands, Texas, New York City. I used to live in California. I have family and friends, people whom I refer to as my family, and the family connection to me is what makes me feel like I'm home.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then I'll pass it to Allegra. If I'm correct, you do live in New Mexico, right? So, so what is home to you?
Yeah, I wasn't born in the Philippines. I was born I was born in New Jersey. And but home for me right now is New Mexico, and it's become during the pandemic, like Jet, I travel a lot for work, and it has been a strange blessing to have to be home without being able to leave and really dig in here in New Mexico. I think the concept of home for me is shifting. Um, well, mostly my career is working with refugees, which can sort of force you to think about what home means, being in such close contact with people who must have a fluid definition of that in order to survive. But also, I think it's notable that this is, in my memory, uh, oh God, did I freeze? Anyway, this is one of the first times. I think my screen froze. Shit.
You're good. We can hear you though.
Oh, okay. I don't know. My computer's not working. Sorry, everyone. But this is the first time I've, like, in the last several months or like during the pandemic, started to feel a little insecure in my country as a home. Um,
Oh, it seems Allegra may be freezing a little bit. Um,
and I think a lot of Americans are feeling that way for the first time. I know many people, if just recently.
Allegra, seems like you froze, so I guess wondering if maybe you can try, I don't know, from your phone.
I'm sorry. This is just the worst.
Okay.
Anyway, I was just saying that I think this is one of the first times in my lifetime that I felt really insecure in my home in the United States, and that I'm learning that a lot of people have felt this way in our country for a really long time, and a lot of Americans are starting to feel really insecure. And it's giving me, it's forcing me to rethink this and to sort of like reconsider my clients' relationships with their homes. And it's been a very interesting year for thinking about that concept and what we have to hold on to and what we could possibly let go of if we needed to.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for your answers. Yeah, I know it's kind of like a tricky question because I think, growing up here, I've always just considered home like Brooklyn, living here in the US. But now, during the past 4 years, it's kind of like, you're like, is this really home? Is this really what this country has to offer me? And do I really want that? But, we have an important election, so I really can't stress enough the importance of like voting. So now I want to talk about, the journey of Olivia, right? So we see Olivia trying to adjust her status, throughout the entire movie, going in the process, but she's not doing this like alone, right? So she has a friend, and her friend Trixie, she's also more or less going in the same journey, except that she has a partner, who she's planning on marrying, but it's someone that she loves and that she cares about. Meanwhile, Isabel is trying to do it like in a different way. She's hiring or essentially paying someone to sort of like fake this like arranged sort of like marriage in order for her to be able to adjust her status. So I guess, and at some point, Isabel's like a love interest, Alex, I believe is what they're driving. He has this question, after he finds out the status of Olivia, right, that she's undocumented. He's like, how do you become legal? So I wanted to ask this question to perhaps like Rose, is like, how does one become legal in this country? What is like the current process for someone like Olivia or Isabel's character, a Filipino trans woman, to address their status?
That's a really important and it's a really good question. And I want to contextualize it a little bit by talking about how people think that it's easy to immigrate to the United States, that it's easy to become, quote, legal. There are three main ways that one can immigrate to the United States or also adjust their status. The main one is through family, and that's the route that Isabel tries, and I'll talk a little bit about how she tries to do that. The other two ones are through an employer. They can petition you if you're exceptional, you have exceptional skills, extraordinary skills, or highly regarded skills. Olivia is a caretaker for Olga, a loving woman to Olga, but for purposes of immigration law, she would not qualify for that kind of an employment-based immigration. The third way is through diversity, and that's only limited for people who are coming from countries where there aren't as many nationals from those countries coming to the United States. The Philippines, I mean, you see here on this panel, there are three of us who are from the Philippines. The Philippines is one of the higher sending nations, right? So employment and diversity won't work. So what is left? We're left with marriage. We're left with family connections. And that's a route that Olivia tries to do. And so how does one become legal in that context? Well, marriage to a US citizen under immigration law is one path, but it's not that easy because there are many different factors that could affect someone's status like Olivia's. How did she arrive to the United States? Did she cross the border or did she come in legally and then overstayed? How long has she been living in the United States without authorization? That has an impact. So someone who has been living here without authorization for more than 6 months and less than a year, if they leave the country, which is almost always necessary if you're going to adjust your status, you might not be able to come back for 3 years. And then it's even worse if you've been here for more than 10 years without authorization. It could be a 10-year bar. So the question, how does one become legal, is really complex. There's a lot of factors that one has to think about. And that also presumes that the marriage itself is valid, that is entered for love and not necessarily for an immigration benefit.
Yeah, and I guess essentially, if you know, if during the interview of Olivia, if she were to fail, or if, like, let's say USCIS were to find out, right, that she had paid to somebody to kind of have this marriage and be able to have her, someone petition for her, like, what will happen?
Yeah, so immigration law um, is very suspicious of these of marriages between U.S. citizens and non-citizens, in particular, if a non-citizen is undocumented or was undocumented. So there's a process that an interview that requires an interview of the citizen and non-citizen, and there are these questions that might lead to some privacy concerns. And they will ask for pictures, they will ask for other evidence, how did you meet? How long have you been together? They might ask about different habits, right? What side of the bed they sleep on. And then if there's even a suspicion, then under immigration law, then that the non-citizen could be subject to a removal proceeding. Right. So there are different, and even after, let's say that in Isabel's case, let's say she got a green card, it's still conditional. That means that the immigration law is still watching you, because then you have to go back after a few years. This US citizen and the non-citizen have to go back before immigration officers and say, hey, we're still married. Here it is. We have a valid marriage. And so now lift this conditional green card and give my spouse a permanent lawful resident or green card status. So that already shows the way that immigration law is structured. It's suspicious of these types of marriages, makes it difficult to actually fully adjust. And so the entire time the couple feels like there's someone watching over them, until eventually the person becomes a green card holder and then would then have a path to citizenship.
Yeah, and I think we see that throughout the film. We see Olivia's
Mhm.
character take pictures during the wedding of Trixie, trying to get, especially
Yeah.
collecting like all this like Polaroids, has this full album, so that she can eventually be able to prove that her marriage is real, even though we as viewers know that it is not. And so I guess now I want to pass it to like Jed. Like I want to see how, as a producer, you thought that it was important to be able to tell the complexity of this immigration stories, right? It's like as we heard from Rose, it's like it's super super complex, and it depends on like basically everyone's case is very different. So I just wanted to know, why did you decide to support this film, and why this story was super important to produce?
For those who are familiar with my work, mostly on Broadway, I only do groundbreaking projects. With Lingua Franca, aside from its brilliant script, which actually I did not know that Isabel wrote. I just found out that it's in the script, and I was like, this name is familiar. And of course, I read it, brilliantly written, and I asked to meet with her. It's important for us to do this kind of projects because there's not enough uprising that we can do, all the protests that we can do, but also in films, again, we can encapsulate it into this platform. It lives on forever. So, and to me, I want to be able to part of that movement that, we raise our voices, we amplify it by creating arts. And I think that's the best way to, amplify our voices.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And we know that it's part of like being able to have like representation when it comes to like immigrants being able to see, like Filipino immigrants being able to see themselves on screen, transgender Filipino immigrants being able to see themselves on screen. So I think the only people that can tell those stories best is like ourselves. Like it's like immigrants ourselves who have lived these experiences, who have heard from our communities what it's like and how tough it is to be able to adjust your status or navigate the immigration system, if there is one for us in this country. So now I want to talk a little bit about, we see that Olivia is in constant fear of being detained by ICE, constantly like living in fear. We see that I know that like throughout the film, there's like a part where you incorporate Isabel, a news clip featuring like Trump. I think this was particular around the zero tolerance policy, which basically it will make any immigrant deportable, anyone who was undocumented deportable, right? But I also saw that like a lot of these visuals, and then they were very subtle, right? We also see that at some point there's a community member that gets detained by ICE, or that gets detained by ICE in the street in Brooklyn. But it's very subtle. I think it was kind of one of those where, like, if you blink, you might not be able to see it because it happens so fast. And I think that's super important because it's not like very like triggering. It's like it's important to know that it happens, but you don't really need to necessarily be able to see to that extent of how ICE harms our communities, because I think we have seen it so much on and off, particularly for the past 4 years. So I wanted to ask you, Isabel, what was important to incorporate that like soundbite from Trump and sort of have that scene of a community member being detained, but also being able to be subtle about that. And you're muted, Isabel.
Right. For me, although, you know, lingua franca is rooted in a very concrete, you know, social reality, my approach in telling the story is more subjective and impressionistic, in that I'm attempting to put the audience in the shoes of Olivia and her emotional state and consciousness, and that as she's trying to live her life, you know, look after Olga, you know, fall in love, and she's trying to pursue a path to citizenship, you know, the threat of arrest by ICE and deportation is a constant hovering and looming presence in her life. In that, although, you know, she's not seeing it everywhere, she's not listening to the news reports, that still pretty much occupies her mind, you know, and her consciousness. And that's definitely how I felt, especially in those first few months after Trump's election and inauguration, where, you know, there's just a feeling of paranoia and claustrophobia and anxiety, in that I'm not sure what would happen. And so that's that the mood and atmosphere of lingua franca is essentially a distillation of also my emotional state during those months. And that, you know, it's one thing to have a film that's a textbook social issue drama, but it's another to have it be more experiential and intimate, in the sense that the audience really finds themselves, you know, like in the shoes, so to speak, of Olivia, and ultimately empathizing with her and identifying with her.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely can relate to that feeling of constantly living under fear of being detained by ICE. It's a feeling that I think our immigrant communities have been feeling for decades, for years, but also like more, it has happened more like in the past 4 years since Trump, you know, sort of became president. But we also know that ICE, you know, it's like, we know that in the past few years, they were detaining children, they were separating families. And we also know that, you know, they were having, you know, immigrant communities like at capacity in these immigrant detention centers, which they were not ready to handle this amount of people that were being detained. And, you know, I now want to ask, like, you know, Allegra, it's like, from your experience, what does immigrant detention look like, particularly for trans women, right? We know that in New Mexico, there's the Cibola Center. So what does detention will look like for somebody like Isabel's character, Olivia?
Well, it's a interesting day to ask this question, because ICE's fiscal year ends today. Their fiscal year starts October 1, and this has been the deadliest year on record in ICE detention in the last 2 decades. ICE has, detention is terrifying, detention is deadly. And, you know, I've been working in ICE detention since 2014, and every year, it becomes more horrifying. You know, just last week we were learning of immigrant women having their organs stolen from them inside of an ICE detention center. And so it is deadly serious. Now, I've worked with, like, so Cibola County, New Mexico is where for the last 3 years, ICE would detain transgender women who they were holding for deportation, whether they were seeking asylum or whether they were arrested internally, like Olivia might have been, something that Olivia feared. it's really well documented how dangerous incarceration situations are for transgender women, because generally speaking, people are incarcerated based on their gender assigned at birth and not their actual gender identity. And that can cause just enormous danger of bullying, discrimination, violence, and sexual assault. I've had 18-year-old girls detained in all male units with 200 men, just like young women in detention, and it's terrifying. So the government attempted to create a solution to that 5 years ago. They wrote what's known as the Transgender Care Memo, where they sort of acknowledge that a trans individual needs they call it a protective custody unit, that they could have, that they need protection from that sort of violence and discrimination, and also that there might be like medical needs or certain needs of care that so they created this unit. First it was Santa Ana, California. An activist shut it down and it moved to Santa Fe, Cibola County, New Mexico, which was how my org found ourselves representing the majority of trans women in the United States in ICE detention. And we represented hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women over that time. It's since closed because basically the government, all the advocacy, which wasn't just ours, it was through a lot of coalition with organizers all over the country. Basically, the Office of the Inspector General just said, like, this facility cannot provide the proper medical care for people. And so they shut it down and dispersed all the trans women in the country around the country. And so now we don't have a protective custody unit for women. But it doesn't even matter because, you know, 2 women have died in New Mexico, 2 trans women in the last couple of years due to medical neglect. All this has been is like 5 years ago, they wrote that memo acknowledging that people need better care. And after 5 years and 2 deaths and just like horrific detention conditions that are like almost too hard to talk about, the only thing that we know now is that it's that like abolition is the only possible solution to it's not to a problem that almost doesn't exist. Like, there is no possible way for ICE to humanely care for not just a trans individual, but any person, man, woman, no gender, child, doesn't matter their nationality. ICE is showing us time and time again that they're not proper custodians for life. And it's time for abolition. And that's everything I've learned from working in the trans pod over the last several years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think many of us are familiar with the case of Roxana Hernandez, right? The trans woman that died at the hands of ICE, you know, because she did not receive the proper care that she needed. You know, so we know that, you know, these institutions, these rogue agencies, they're not there to protect us. They really don't care. But in particular now, they don't care for like immigrant communities. They don't give them the proper support that they need to attend their needs, whether it's like food, health. But yeah, so we're definitely like living in very difficult times, but it's like super important to be able to talk about this and be able to share those stories. And so I guess now, you know, I wanted to ask Jet, like, you know, what was the process like of like while filming, while producing this film, why was it like important to kind of be able to tell the stories, but also be able to be like subtle about how we don't really want to like trigger immigrant communities after they have already seen so much of what's happening around the country?
Yeah, I will let Isabel add to what I have. This film is actually all Isabel. But about the intentionality of the film is that we wanted to make sure that that grim part of our national status now is being presented again in a very subtle way. It's not gruesome, it's not torturous, it's not something that you would close your eyes when scenes are presented. But yeah, it's intentional, but subtly. It's because we're advocating for these rights, especially for the trans community in the United States. So I'll pass it to Isabel to add more into the intentionality of that film.
Mute.
I keep muting myself. My goal with Lingua Franca is really to humanize, you know, someone like Olivia, who I've said, in just before, as a Gold Star minority, not only is she a woman, she's a trans woman of color who's also an immigrant who happens to be undocumented. And this is the kind of life and subjectivity that has, until now, I feel felt invisible in American cinema. And, I ultimately wanted to not just portray how horrific and tense her situation can be, but to show her, living her daily life, and performing her seemingly mundane rituals. I feel like if we see Olivia doing her household chores, having breakfast, thinking, and just observing this character in her natural habitat being, there's a sense of power in it, because by seeing her performing her daily tasks and chores and experiencing life, it's an assertion of personhood and selfhood and agency. And I feel it's at that moment that this person ceases being merely a statistic and a broader socio-political canvas in the US, but becomes, a real person, whose joys, desires, disappointments, and hopes are something that we could relate with and empathize with. And I feel like once we see a person, someone like Olivia, as a true person, and whoever is in the audience begins to empathize with those universal human emotions, I think that's really the beginning of change and, hopefully action as well on the part of the spectator, and being part of a movement to uplift and protect someone like Olivia in their own lives and in their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, it's definitely like a very difficult time. We've seen that it's important to be able to tell these stories, but to show representation and to show everyone that we're basically living normal lives just like everyone else. We're just trying to survive, work, make a living, make our dreams come true, and for Olivia, we see that she's trying to find, I guess, essentially like liberation by being able to have like be accepted in her own community here in Brooklyn, but also be able to be able to eventually potentially be able to visit her mother back home, right? Which you can only do it if you're able to travel outside the U.S. And many of us are often who come here are separated by our families, have not seen loved ones in decades, right? And so I think it's important for the audience to put themselves in our shoes and kind of be able to see that we live regular lives like everyone else. So whenever folks use that term of like alien or terms like illegal, it's those things are very like harmful, and something that I noticed in your films, like not once is the word illegal ever heard. I feel like and that's something that has happened because we've been able to change the narrative to say that like we're undocumented, and it just means that we don't have papers, but that does not mean yet you can call us like illegal or aliens, which are really triggering and powerful narratives.
Yeah. And just very briefly, I wanted to add, also in terms of the portrayal of being trans, in a lot of movies that feature trans characters, especially by cisgender white male directors, it almost always focuses on the gender transition process. And I'm not saying that's not a valid aspect of being trans, but, being trans is, there's a diversity and whole gamut of experience. And my film essentially starts well after the gender transition process, and you don't hear the word trans every 5 minutes, and if it does come up and it's a derogatory word, it's one of, just one friend of Alex, who is part of a community that, is conservative, misogynistic, and transphobic, and in a way that feels organic and not forced into the story.
yeah, I think that was one of the most upsetting scenes, seeing like this friend of Alex just going into her room, uh, looking for her stuff, looking for her passport, which we know, had her previous name. So, but yeah, so now I wanted to pass it to Allegra and Rose. I really want you to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing. So maybe I'll start with Rose about the work that you're doing in New Jersey and why it's important now more than ever to do this work for immigrant communities.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, I run a Center on Immigration Law, Policy, and Justice. It's a center that does both policy work, and by that I mean that we help to pass laws and policies in the state and local municipalities, local governments. And the reason why we focus on state and local government advocacy is because the federal government is so hostile at this moment to immigrants. I'm not going to say that before President Trump got elected that the federal government was also welcoming, right? I mean, we've had problems even with the prior administration, but the last 3.5 years have just really been extremely hostile. And so I and some of my colleagues and students, I see in the participants a couple of my fellows, former fellows and current fellow in the center. We work with community-based organizations like Make the Road in New Jersey to try to pass laws that help immigrants feel that they belong, that New Jersey is their home. And so we had advocated successfully to get a law passed in New Jersey that allows undocumented immigrants to get a driver's license. This past summer, we were successful in helping to advocate for undocumented immigrants to be able to apply for a professional license that they are eligible for, that they're qualified for. So we believe that doing these on the ground state and local government advocacy, where immigrants have day-to-day experiences and interactions with their neighbors, with people around them, that's really important for making them feel welcome. And so that's part of the work that we do at the center. We also do research and we worked with other disciplines in order to have a broader understanding of immigration law, how it's been shaped historically, but also today. So part of the reason why I was really happy to be part of this project, this panel, is because I see film as a really important platform for changing the hearts and minds of people. I'm a lawyer. Law is really conservative. It's really, really hard. As Allegra will tell you, it's really hard to get laws changed. But through film like this one, I think we can really get to some kind of cultural change. So that's important. That's a part of the ethos that my center does, is to work outside of law and be able to have a much more broader and holistic look at current issues that are facing us today.
Thank you. And I'll pass it to Allegra. So Allegra, if you can tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in New Mexico and why is it important to do this work more than ever now?
Sure. So I founded a nonprofit here in New Mexico 5 years ago called Santa Fe Dreamers. And really I am not an immigrant, as I mentioned, but I was a public school teacher in our immigrant community. And I was a public school teacher for a third grade class the first time we had an ICE raid in Santa Fe. And it shocked the living hell out of me, the experience. It was in 2005. And it essentially, like, I went to law school and founded this nonprofit because I think lawyers and can be a direct tool to helping people get economic benefits, community development, kids to get better educational attainment, families to stay together, and lately to liberate people from detention. We try and promote, like, all of our services are free, and we try and promote like radical access to the most high quality immigration lawyers you can find in New Mexico, because we are like, I mean, I don't know the last time anyone tried to hire a lawyer. It's a nightmare. It's so expensive and it's terrifying. And so we see provide that these legal services are like a platform for helping people pull in from the margin, so to speak, and to make their families stronger, their lives stronger, their opportunities more abundant, and recognizing that that's not just about them, that's about my non-immigrant family, that's about the nephews. I don't have kids, but like the family I'm raising, is that they're going to be better off living in a world, in a country, in a community that honors our neighbors and not and doesn't like hunt them down and try to deport them. Our work has taken a really scary turn over the last several years because of again, like my career started under Obama and it was a nightmare. So I don't want to be like too political in my impression, but the Trump administration, I mean, there's 2 new detention centers open in New Mexico, and the border has become a horrifically dangerous place, even more dangerous than it was. And so a lot of the work I'm working on right now, because I'm like the lead, like I'm leading the strategy on border and detention, is just like simply to try and prevent the loss of life in our detention centers and through our deportation processes. When I started my job, I used to think of myself as like standing behind my neighbors and helping push them towards, better opportunities. And now I see myself as standing between my neighbors and the government, and it's just like a really jarring change. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we know that even under the Obama administration, there was definitely a lot of like deportations that were happening. But I think now it's more visible just under Trump because like children were being detained, people were dying like for like the first time in years at the hands of ICE. So it's like a lot definitely changed in the past few years. And I know, Isabel, that you wanted to be super intentional about being able to have this conversation on representation, but also like being able to see how we can help immigrant communities find resources, help them with connect with any type of like legal services if there's some sort of legal avenue for them to adjust their status. But I guess like if there's one thing that you wanted to get, you want folks to get out of after watching this film, like what would that be? And you're muted again.
I think, ultimately, my approach with this kind of story is that you expect a film that touches on topical themes like immigration and, the transgender experience in the US to be, somewhat didactic or preachy or loud or agitated, but my approach has been more thoughtful and patient and nuanced and subtle is because I want to compel viewers to think more deeply and more critically about Olivia and her situation and, the broader issues of the immigration and trans experience that I touched on. I also, the ending, especially her decision to not, accept the marriage proposal might seem counterintuitive and impractical and foolish, but that's also the moment where I'm asking the audience to look at Olivia as a person more than just an undocumented immigrant or a transgender woman looking for love. And I'm not trying to make a film that, like you feel pity for someone like Olivia and tie it up neatly by the end of it so you can just walk away and feel good about yourself. I wanted to make a film that was haunting and lingering and unsettled because the issues at its core, continue to be unsolved and unresolved. And I want, the audiences to think about her and these issues for days and longer, even longer than that, so that they're compelled to actually take action in their own lives and with people that they know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess now, Jed, I want to pass it to you and see like what is one thing that you hope folks at home who are watching this, who have watched this film to get out of the film?
Yeah, actually, I enjoy this topic very much because I have quite a few people reach out to me already and their own interpretation of the film. Again, the film is multifaceted, right? But for me personally, I don't want to give away the ending, but to me, that's a happy ending because Olivia chose her own agency. She, to me, that's women empowerment to me, that she chose self-respect, the dignity, that no one should ever play with your emotional strife or whatever you have going on in life. So at the end of the day, you're a human being that someone should respect you, and you have to take your self dignity. So that, to me, that's just my personal point of view, and that's I wish some people haven't seen it yet or have, and maybe see it again. And just don't forget to turn on the subtitles on, because we have Cebuano, Tagalog, Russian, but mostly English. But just turn on the subtitle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that we have a lot of questions, so I'm just gonna wrap this up so I can move on to questions. But I have one last question for Isabel. I know there's also like another scene when Alex and Olivia are playing, role playing, right? And where Olivia introduces herself as Isabel, right? So your name. So and I feel like that's like it was like a beautiful moment, because I'm like, oh my god, like I know Isabel made this film, she wrote this film, and so it's kind of like a beautiful moment to kind of see you like kind of reassure yourself and say like, oh, I am Isabella, you know, in this role playing moment. So what was it like to play the role of Olivia in this film?
For me, I've said that this film is not autobiographical, but since Olivia is a character that I wrote, I definitely see part of myself in her. There's an emotional and psychological truth about me in my portrayal of Olivia, and I think I was also trying to make a statement, being an underrepresented storyteller and filmmaker in this industry, in that someone like me who can be easily written off, can be reckoned with and can be a creative force both in front of and behind the camera, in telling not just any story, but a story that I want to tell, and in my own voice and sensibility. And that feels like such an ambitious gamble. And I'm very grateful that I have producers like Jet, Carla Bileo, Darlene Malimas, who are also Filipino immigrants and artists themselves, and who trusted in my, talent and my voice. And we pulled it off together. And I, wanted to encourage and, empower minority filmmakers and storytellers out there that, just do it and tell your own stories.
Yeah. And thank you so much for telling that story like really beautifully. I've seen it like 2 times already, and hopefully I will watch it many more times.
Thanks, Ricardo.
And before moving to questions, I do just want to ask briefly, Rose and Allegra, how can folks at home like support our fights, right, for immigrant communities based on the work that you're doing? I know we're going to be sharing resources after this panel, but how can, in like a brief sentence, how can folks support our fights? Rose?
So I would encourage everyone who wants to work on behalf of immigrants and their families to find a local-based organization, an organization that they could be a part of and help them in various ways in the community. There are numerous ways to support immigrants and their families, whether it's to being an ally, walking with them to the courthouse if they have a check-in, helping them with their citizenship application if they're eligible for that process, helping them with their citizenship interviews, getting them prepared for that, helping to just be there and listen to them. There's a lot of mental anguish and emotional anguish with being undocumented, and to simply be there and offer your support, to me, is one way. Of course, there are places, organizations like Make the Road in New York, Make the Road in New Jersey, that I would like to, and the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, Legal Services. There are many organizations out there. And my advice is to find one that is closest to you. That way that you can be there to physically, when we're done with the pandemic, hopefully eventually. Having worked with local community-based organizations, it's nice to be connected with them outside of the virtual world.
And now, Allegra, how can folks who watch this film or who are on this panel, who are attending this panel right now, how can they support our fights?
Yeah, everything Rose said, but also truly educate yourself. The amount that Americans do not understand about American immigration policy, about political asylum, about the process of coming legally, it's this wedge issue in our country that people are feverishly voting around. Yet, I do a lot of like nationwide education, and you ask a room full of people, like, how is it? I mean, you're so like into the legal process. Can a single person in this room articulate what that process is? And it's crickets. And so we're making these enormous emotional decisions that affect so many vulnerable people in our country. And most of us don't have any clue how these policies interact in our society. So educate yourself also. Just straight up resist any words, any articles, any films, any politicians, any narrative that promotes the criminalization of migrants. You don't need my permission. You don't need anyone's permission to tell someone to go fuck themselves if they try and tell you that someone who had the courage to migrate to this country and the courage to navigate this system is a criminal. Like, you don't need to have a doctorate like some of us do to be able to look that person in the eye and say, you're wrong. We're never going to get good policy as long as we stay addicted to this idea that migrants need to be punished in our country.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I often hear this line of like, why don't you go back to the end of the line? And I'm like, if there's a line, like I will gladly go and join it. But we know for many of us, there's no such thing as a line where people can just get on and be able to find a path to citizenship. So we know it's complicated for everyone, depending on where you're from, but particularly we know that like for Black immigrants, for brown immigrants, for trans immigrants, it's super, super complex to be able to adjust your status. So now I want to move it to the questions to the audience. So I want to say thank you to everyone for the questions. We do have a lot of great ones. So this question is for Jed. So what was your role as the producer of the film? And this is from Lucy.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you for the question. First off, this is a team's effort. I like to say that it took a village. A lot of people get involved, and this is a labor of love. Mainly, my role was to fundraise. My background, again, on Broadway is I'm a commercial producer, and I think my expertise is pitching for the commerciality of a certain project to prospective investors. So with Lingua Franca, we have 11 investors. 7 of them are Filipinos and 4 are Caucasians. Also, I try to be involved as much as I can creatively. But at that time during the shoot, I was in the Philippines. I was producing a national tour of a Broadway show. So kudos to Isabel for doing it by herself, and Carla wasn't available also. So that was my main role. And then after that, we collectively team up to identify who should be our distributor. We had to interview quite a lot of companies to represent us. And it's still ongoing. And, this thing that Lingua Franca found itself, it's quite remarkable. We didn't expect this. So thank you for your question, Lucy.
And I have another question just in regards to funding, and this is from Anonymous. And this is, I guess, for Isabella, for you, Jed. For trans filmmakers watching us at home, right? Like, how can you share how this film was funded? How can they go about funding in order for them to be able to tell more stories like this one? So what was the journey of getting this project financed?
Jed.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure I'm quite ready to share my recipe yet on how to pitch projects, but mainly is, I guess, believe in it, because if you don't believe your project, no one will. And show it would help also if you have some record to speak about yourself, what you've done, and all that. And yeah, and once you find that tribe, stick with them. I'm talking about also the creative team, because they can fully take you the home run, because we got some grants also. I let Isabel talk about the grants that we got.
Yeah, just very quickly, in terms of the financing structure of the film, our budget was a little under 500K. About 75% of that was through private equity. So through Jet's hard work, and about 20% was funded through grants. So we got a grant, we got a 50K grant from the Foundation for the Arts. We got grants from the Tribeca Film Institute, Jerome Foundation, Frameline, which is a queer, film organization. And of course, that was before the pandemic. So it's changed since then, especially since like Tribeca Film Institute just shut its doors. And about 5% we funded through a Kickstarter campaign, so crowdfunding. We had some friends who were eager to support the project, but they did not have like 10K lying around, to buy a unit to invest in the film. So that's why we launched a campaign, and that's how the film got funded.
Thank you so much. And this question is for Rose and Isabel. So it says, I helped someone become legalized over 20 years ago, and it was very complicated. How closely does the film stick to current requirements? It is that simple to get married and become legal as the film depicts this scenario? It's a beautiful film, and this is from Rick.
Yeah, definitely not that easy. I mean, I do think that that the film presents a lot of the experiences of undocumented people in this country, and their fear of being arrested, detained, and deported. But with respect to marrying a U.S. citizen and then adjusting their status, as I had mentioned earlier, it's just there's so many factors that are involved here in actually being able to adjust your status, including whether you whether the marriage was entered into for love and not for an immigration benefit. If the unauthorized migrant has either overstayed or crossed the border without authorization, that could play a factor in her or his their ability to adjust, how long they've been unauthorized in the United States. So it's not that easy to just be able to find someone and a U.S. citizen, and then all of a sudden, then you have this path to getting a green card. And then even once you've started the process, there are many ways still that things could go wrong, because immigration law deeply suspects these marriages. And so you're made to feel that you entered in this because of fraud, right? And so it's really, that's the reality, that's the lived experience of many people. So to the person who asked that question, thank you for helping that person, and I hope that things have gone well for them. But I think, as Isabel's character presents to us, it's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, I guess going to that, Isabel, was there any sort of like research that you did before while writing the script around, how somebody like Olivia's character can, find a path to citizenship?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Olivia's experiences in the film, although they're not, mine, but I'm an immigrant myself, and I also pursued a different path to citizenship. They're composite of real experiences from people that I know, or friends of friends. Like I certainly know a few people, not just Filipinos, like immigrants who have arranged, green card marriages. And I know of a few trans women who have gone that route as well. And, that they managed to fall in love, and the person that they're in love with, who happens to be an American citizen, chose to marry them. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have another question for you and Jet. How long did it take to bring the film together? What was the making process? And how long did you work on the script?
Yeah, it was about 3.5 years. When I started writing the film, I was transitioning. And more than halfway through writing the film, that's when Trump got elected, and that's when the final premise and overarching mood and tone of the film really came together. And about a year and a half after that, that's shortly after I finished the script, Jet and the other producers came on board, and we put the financing and the casting together, and then we shot in the fall of 2018. And I edited the film myself for the next 4 or 5 months. So through February, March 2019, we then submitted it to Venice Film Festival in June of last year. And we were very, very fortunate that they chose Lingua Franca as one of 11 feature films for that particular section out of nearly 1,000 feature films that were submitted. And so Lingua Franca had its world premiere at the Venice International Film Festival last year and has been traveling since. It was released in France theatrically in July. And the maverick filmmaker Eva DuVernay and her distribution company Array acquired the film from North America, and we premiered on Netflix last month.
Yeah, if I may add, what's the number of days? Actually, I think 16 shoot days, right, Isabel? That's how long. Yeah, in 16 days. I was probably the last person to be involved, to get on board with the team. And pitching it definitely had some struggles because some that we pitched to, they wanted a different kind of ending or a different tone. And this is where I appreciate and I admire Isabel for sticking to her guns and for speaking her truth, that no amount of money can be, she can be bribed. Let's put it that way. She knows what she's doing. And I don't think we would have this kind of. So far, the film has won in 6 international film festivals already, and recently just named the best film in Portugal at the 24th. At the 24th Queer Lisboa. So it's pretty awesome. So if we have surrendered or submitted to what other people wanted the film to be, I don't think we would be in this position right now. So kudos to Isabel for sticking to her guns.
Thanks, Jet.
Yeah, and congrats to all the awards, all the promotion. I definitely have been seeing it a lot and being shared a lot and being talked about. So congrats on all of that. Now I have another question for Rose. So Rose, can people who are citizens of Mexico and other Latin American countries come into the U.S. freely, or do they need a visa? How long could someone stay? Could someone come into the U.S. on a tourist visa and then seek asylum? And this is from Mara Meyer.
Maybe I think I would love for Allegra to help with the asylum one and refugee, because that's more of her expertise. But let me just generally cover what it means to come to the United States. So if you're not a citizen and you do need a visa, there are some countries that participate in what's called a visa waiver program. That means, in many of the countries in Europe participate in that. That means that when they come, people from nationals of Europe, when they come here, then they can enter without a visa and stay here for X number of days. But for the majority of people coming from other countries, they need to have a visa to enter the United States. So that includes people from Mexico, people down south, and that being able to present a visa. The one thing I'd add there is that I used to teach a class on the border in El Paso, Texas. And in my class, I would invite consular officers from across the border from Juarez. And they would, so these are US consular officers, and they would tell my students that, okay, guess how long it takes them to review a visa application when people line up by 5 a.m. in the morning to go before a US consular. Guess how long it will take? Like 20 seconds. That's all it would take them. They would look at the person who is in front of them in the window, how they're dressed, what they look like, whether they have makeup or not. And then they would look at their application, and then right there be able to decide whether or not to give them a visa. So it's not easy at all to get a visa to come to the United States. So that's just one example of that. Allegra, do you want to add a few things?
Yeah, of course. Like, so the population of folks who I tend to work with are people who are ineligible for visas, or maybe eligible for an immigrant visa or a non-immigrant visa, but they don't have time to wait for one. Their life is threatened, and so you can come to any port of entry. And this happens a lot on our southern border, and you don't have to wait online. You can cross between ports. People call that crossing illegally, but there is no real illegal way to ask for asylum. Our asylum laws allow for any way you can set your foot in the United States. The second your foot is there, you can turn to a consular officer or the arresting officer, and you can say, my life's in danger and I need to be put in the asylum process. What's interesting is folks who come with a visa, they have a year to assert their need for political asylum. Most of my clients are detained, so they ask for asylum in the detention process. But let's say you got a visa from the Philippines and you came over through like JFK. You have a year with which to ask for asylum if your life is in danger in your home country. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but what's interesting about trans individuals, though, is that often, even if they've been in the country for a really long time, like Olivia, I don't know how long Olivia was in the US, but I presume it was more than a year. She could, there's an exception for people who have changed circumstances, right? So a transition can actually provide a trans individual with a reopened opportunity to ask for political asylum after they're outside of the year deadline. In fact, my office, we're working on a case for a young woman from India right now who recently transitioned, and we're saying, look, she's different from when she first came to the US. Her circumstances have changed, and now we're going to start asylum. So that's like a really, if anyone's listening to this, absolutely do not attempt this without a really good lawyer. But it's a way that folks who are from violent regions of the world where trans lives are in danger can actually find pathways to legal permanent residence.
Yeah, so it's very. I mean, I'm like a DACA recipient. I know that DACA recipient is mostly like a program. It's not really a law. So technically, it could be taken away anytime, and which Trump attempted to do, and the VHS is currently trying to end again, even though the Supreme Court had said that this program was legal. So I know how complex it is to try to adjust your status here. This question is for Isabel and Orjet. So this is from Roger. It's a former colleague of mine who I used to work with in the restaurant industry. I was wondering why it was decided to not subtitle the parts where they spoke in Filipino throughout the film. And this is for Isabel or Orjet.
Yeah, it's actually subtitled. You just have to turn on, like, it's Netflix's fault. So you have to like turn on the closed captioning so you can read the subtitles, but they're there.
So that
apologies.
And there's another question for Isabel. So what was Isabel's experience like in her filmmaking career overall and starting out as a filmmaker? So Isabel, what was your experience?
Yeah, just very briefly, I did not go to film school, although I've been in love with the movie since I was a kid. It took me a while to really convince myself that, filmmaking can be a grown-up career. I started out, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, which helped with, screenwriting for sure. I started out in brand management, so in marketing roles, but it wasn't until I was in my, after graduating college, I worked in Manila for a year in marketing, and then I moved to the US to pursue a master's degree. And that's actually how my path to citizenship, like I was here on a student visa, and then I applied for an O1 visa, which is a visa for aliens with extraordinary ability in the arts and sciences. I was a published writer in some major national magazines in the Philippines. So I got an O1 visa as a writer, and then eventually as a filmmaker, and that's how I got my green card. But yeah, I decided, a few years after I got my master's to just take the plunge and make my first feature called Senorita, which premiered at a major international film festival and just continued making films after that. I made my first two features back in the Philippines, and then I transitioned, and Lingua Franca is my first film after my transition, and also my first to be set in and produced in the US. So I'm very, very, overjoyed and pleasantly surprised that it's been so warmly received by the audiences and the critics as well.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, it's like no surprise. I personally have not seen a film as beautifully told about this immigrant experience like
Thank you.
in many years. So I'm really excited about all your success, and I know you probably worked really, really hard, and
Thank you.
probably had barely any sleep to be able to finish this project. And I know you're still working really hard to promote it and get it out there. So it's really beautiful to see all of the accomplishments that it's had so far. Another question also for Isabel and Jet. So the question is, since Filipino culture is deeply influenced by socioeconomic politics and the continuous trauma of imperialism, what is your perspective in the direction of Filipino cinema globally? Where did you see yourselves in lingua franca within the film community and in general in the entertainment industry? This is from Matt 10.
Also in terms of my growth and evolution as a filmmaker for the last 50 years, since for the cinephiles, out there listening, like Lino Broca, who's a Filipino master, he's been very much associated with social realism. And I feel like that's been the mode and aesthetic that a lot of Filipino filmmakers, especially art house Filipino filmmakers, have been operating in. And it's because that's the kind of depiction of Philippine society that is well received by international festival programmers. And for me, every filmmaker, regardless of their ethnicity or their, background, is an individual. And we should, each one of us should pursue and make art in the voice and sensibility that feels most authentic to us. My next feature, called Tropical Gothic, which I just finished the script for, is not a social realism piece. It is, a surreal film, but it tackles the theme of colonialism. It's set in the 16th century Philippines in the early years after the Spanish colonizers established a settlement in the Philippine Islands. So I think it's important to my personal growth as a filmmaker that I continue to take risks creatively and aesthetically and find new ways to express my ideas. Yeah. And that's just speaking of my own personal experience. I cannot, deign to speak on behalf of all the Filipino filmmakers, both in the Philippines and in the diaspora, because we have our own individual experiences.
Yeah, if I may add, yes, Filipino culture, I think as any immigrant, group of immigrants, we are rich in stories. It's about identifying, what's important. Again, we're standing on shoulders of those masters that paved the way for us for the socioeconomic platform. But we also have projects that, hopefully could be commercial as well, because we'd like to lure in other people who are not really familiar with the entertainment business. And as a commercial producer myself, I'd like to introduce that to them. And how is it also financially viable? That I personally have lost money in stocks, and I wish I would have had put that in a film actually, where I can see the creation, that my name lives there forever, rather than just to a write-off for IRS, and which does not really make me happy at all. But creating something in films really lives on forever. So yeah, so we're not really just focusing on that, on social economic. But again, as an introduction, as a calling card for Isabel, for our team, we got to do that. But we have a variety of projects coming up.
And here I also have another question. It says, did you prefer filming in the Philippines over the US?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Isabel.
Oh, it really depends on the story that I want to tell. It just so happens that, my first two features, I wrote the stories to be set in the Philippines. And even though I've already been living in the US by that time, I wanted to go back just because, those are the stories that I still gravitated to. But I feel like after I transitioned, that was when it, I hit a turning point where the US felt like home. And I started, just naturally and organically coming up with stories about characters, who are living their lives in their new home country in the US. But yeah, in terms of, logistics, it's very different shooting in the Philippines. There, sometimes there's, we can say that it's slightly more lax when it comes to like safety and health protocols over there. Film workers tend to be worked a little harder and more aggressively over there. And I feel like that there's certainly more safety and health protocols and protections here.
To add, I think this question is from,
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce this, Atalex Garcia. Thank you for the question. Personally, one of my advocacies is to introduce or bring Filipino artists here. We have a lot of great artists in the Philippines that I'd like to be featured to our projects, merging, Broadway and Hollywood connection and make it into a film. That was my first initial try was with Crazy Rich Asians, and that was successful in having Chris Aquino there. Though it's a small role, but it worked. So yeah, we have some. I personally have some projects also filming over there, but that's what Isabel mentioned. It's challenging because there's I'd like to be delicate in saying this, but there's not an active actors union, and I go for that. I'm all for that. The Filipino artists that we have on our project, we treat them as if they're Americans. So everyone is equal. So yeah, we will be shooting in the Philippines soon. So just hang tight.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the questions. I do have one more question. This is about the ending. So this is a question for Isabel about the ending of Lingua Franca. You clearly reject the typical Hollywood happy ending, but it's not clear for me why you do so, since you prepared the audience for a happy ending with the relationship between Alex and Olivia, and Alex getting back his life back on track. Essentially, we know that it would be easy for Olivia to accept Alex's marriage proposal, which that would be the simple solution, but she rejects that, and essentially Alex disappears from her life. What was the intention behind that?
I know that it was Alan who asked that question, and he commented shortly after that that had answered that question earlier. But I just wanted to reiterate very, quickly that ultimately it was a matter of agency, Olivia gaining back her agency that influenced her decision, because I think it ultimately has to do with, the perspective that you're looking at the situation. Like, and for me, there could have been no other ending, because if I was in Olivia's shoes, would I really want to, marry a man who exploited my deepest fears and anxieties as an undocumented person? And a man who, considering his background and his history, who might be, unreliable and troubled, and considering his family and community, it's not likely that he's gonna extricate himself and like stand his ground, and his relationship with a transgender woman. So the ending is cautiously optimistic and realistic, and that the very final line of the film belongs to Olivia, and she tells her mom in a phone call, in her native Cebuano, that we'll get there eventually. And immigrants have always been resourceful and self-reliant and resilient. And I want Olivia's story to, even though it's a very particular and specific life and experience, to be emblematic of why immigrants move to countries outside their home countries and attempt to start a new life despite, adversity and danger.
Thank you. And that answers all of the questions. So thank you everyone who joined us tonight. And I guess just to go back on the theme of like home and like what is home to many of us, if you can just say in one word, each one of you, what can we do to make sure that immigrants feel at home in this country? And Rose?
To make them feel welcomed, treat them like family, right? To me, family is home, home is family, and that's how we ought to treat our neighbors, immigrants. They should be considered family.
Allegra?
To remember that not only do immigrants deserve a life here, but that we deserve a life with them, and that's what our country's about.
Jet?
Unless you're a Native American, try to reflect on your ancestors and how they come to this country. Okay, be in their place and try to feel their life the first time that they got here, because all of us are immigrant here, again, unless you're a Native American. So try to be inclusive, be empathetic, be just a human being, and we could coexist, and respect each other's rights and boundaries.
Isabel?
Yeah, I must not sound like a grade school teacher, but I want to invoke the golden rule, which is, treat an immigrant how you would like yourself to be treated.
Yeah, and going to what Jet said, definitely folks to do the research or where they come from, because we're all immigrants. You
Yes.
can read it on my shirt, but at the end it says, no human being is illegal on stolen land. And immigration is a human rights issue. So for me, citizenship for all will be what will make immigrants feel at home here in this country. And now, thank you so much for everyone. If you haven't seen the film, I recommend watching it or watching it again, but also being able to share this story around. We know it's available on Netflix. Who doesn't have Netflix? We all have Netflix, or we can, let someone borrow our accounts, but continue to share this film, because these stories are super important for immigrants, for trans immigrants, for Black trans immigrants, for everyone that is an immigrant in this country. And I want to thank everyone who was part of this panel, and I want to thank the Belichick Foundation for hosting it tonight. I really appreciate it, and I'll pass it to you, Liz.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Ricardo, thank you so much for moderating. Again, I just want to express all of my gratitude to all of our panelists for this evening, and all of your organizations who really co-supported and helped us share this event outwards. To Rose and the Rutgers Center for Law, Immigration, Justice, and Policy, to Isabel and the team at Array and her producers, Jet and Carlo, who we worked with a bit last year with the Hawaii International Film Festival, to Allegra and to Santa Fe Dreamers Project, and for providing resources in the chat list. And Ricardo, again, just for being a phenomenal moderator and really allowing everybody's voices and experiences to shine. I'm so grateful to you and to Make the Road. And thank you to everyone for attending and for bringing great conversation and great questions to the discussion. As we mentioned at the beginning, we'll be putting together a resources list to share, and we'll send this out to everyone who attended, and we'll be sharing this on our site and through email tomorrow, hopefully, and in the next few days. But please, anyone who has additional questions, please follow up, and thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks to the Belichick Foundation.
Cheers. Thanks,
Enjoy the rest of
Isabel.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everybody.
Ricardo,
Thanks.
Allegra, Rose, Jet.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.